Hi friends, thanks for joining in. Today we're going to talk about different tunings for hurdy-gurdy as well as the different configurations of those tunings, meaning unison versus octave. We'll also compare an alto gurdy to a soprano gurdy and the difference between those and a tenor gurdy. Are you confused about what any of this means? Well, stay tuned and we'll explain it all. I'm George Leverett of Alter Wind Music and you are watching Hurdy-Gurdy World. Marvelous. Thanks for joining in. I'm also monitoring your comments throughout this, so if you have any questions as we go, feel free to chime in. Today, pardon me, I'm checking some audio settings. Marvelous, we're good. All right, to understand hurdy-gurdy tunings, I'm going to reference a lot to violin tunings throughout this. If you don't play violin, that's okay. If you don't understand how violins are tuned and why it's even relevant to a hurdy-gurdy, you don't really need to know that too much. You'll still be able to follow with the information I'll be presenting. Why do I reference a violin when I'm talking about a hurdy-gurdy? Well, there's a lot of similarities. A lot of the hurdy-gurdy tunings kind of derive from violin tunings. I'll explain as I go. To start with, I'm going to discuss how a violin is tuned. And again, if you feel like you're in over your head on this, that's okay. This is very superficial. A violin has 4 strings, as you can see from the graphic, and you've probably seen violins as well in the past. Violins are considered a soprano instrument. If you don't know what that word means, that's just kind of a loose label for the range in which its tuning falls. As you can see, the 4 strings are labeled in their tuning E, A, D, G. The bottom string on a violin is E. The second to bottom is an A. The D is the third one. And G is the 4th string. You might be wondering, why is there a 3 after the G? Why is there a 4 after a D? Those are kind of references to where they would fall on a keyboard. For instance, the 3rd G on the keyboard going from the left is called G3, etc. Why does that relate to a hurdy-gurdy? Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, I have a violin I was using. As I mentioned a moment ago, hurdy-gurdy tunings are, I don't know if they're derived from the violin, but there are a lot of similarities. I like to think they're derived because it's just with a few tweaks of a violin tuning, you have a hurdy-gurdy tuning. I'll show you what I mean as we go. You have 2 hurdy-gurdy tunings. If you've been through our website, we kind of cover that in some detail. One is called the C-G tuning. One is called the G-D tuning. The C-G tuning, all strings are either C's or G notes. The G-D tuning, all the strings are tuned to either G or D notes on a hurdy-gurdy. Hopefully that makes sense. Steve Weinert joining in. I'm sure I mangled your name. Thanks for joining, brother. Good to see you. Back to the hurdy-gurdy. C-G tuning. Let's cover that and how it relates to a violin. You see these 4 violin strings that we were looking at a moment ago, E, A, D, G. Well, let's tweak that for hurdy-gurdy. There we go. You can see the violin strings, E, A, D, G, but we kind of cross out the A and lower it a step to a G. That's where we have a C-G tuning for a hurdy-gurdy. Now I'm just talking about the melody strings, the 2 that actually change pitch when you press buttons. There's 2 different configurations of the C-G tuning. One is where the melody strings are in unison to that G4 note there. The other is when they're an octave apart. So you'll have one melody string as G4 and the other as G3. I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to pull out my old girl Frankensteina for this demo. If you've seen this before, she actually made an appearance on Saturday Night Live a couple of years ago. This is my main festival instrument. I call her Frankensteina because we put a lot of miles on each other hitting the festivals throughout the West Coast. And also, whenever I have a new idea for building a hurdy-gurdy, usually I'll start by ripping apart some aspect of Frankensteina and retroing something in there to test it out before putting in production. Back to my point, which was I was talking about CG tuning, and I had two different variants. One is the unison tuning, one is the octave tuning. I'll demonstrate the unison tuning. Here's where we have both melody strings tuned to the same note in unison. There's the melody strings. I'll turn on a drone and do a little sample song, and you can get a flavor for the unison tuning. I mentioned a moment ago, I mentioned there's another variant of the CG tuning, and that's where the melody strings are tuned an octave apart. I have a gurdy set up in that tuning as well. This is my full Monty. I call her Maleficent because I carved the headstock after the main character in the movie, Maleficent. Anyway, Maleficent is set up as a 4-string melody strings. Her C chanters are in that octave tuning. There's the first one, which is tuned just like the other ones I just demoed, but here's the one an octave lower. I'll play it by itself. You hear it's a little lower. I'll turn them on at the same time. Slightly different sound. I'll demo the same song I just played using the octave tuning here. There you go, two different sounds. A lot of people ask, well, do I have to make a choice if I have a hurdy-gurdy? Am I locked in? No, it's usually just swapping a string around and you can get either tone from your hurdy-gurdy, whether you want the melody strings in unison or an octave apart. If I'm your maker, just let me know. If you have another maker, let them know and they'll make some string recommendations for you. I see some new people joining us. Timothy Price, very groovy to see you, and Catherine McLean. Groovy to see you too. Thanks for joining in. I mentioned there's two hurdy-gurdy tunings. The one I'm talking about right now is the CG tuning. All the strings are tuned to either C or G notes. As we see, there's the melody strings highlighted in red, kind of riffed on a violin tuning. The thing about the CG tuning is the instrument falls pretty naturally in the key of C, like a piano, by which I mean I have 2 rows of keys. The bottom row is set up just like a piano keyboard, like the white keys of a piano. The upper row are the sharps and flats, or like the black keys of a piano. So the CG tuning, although you can play in other keys with it, the keyboard kind of naturally falls in the key of C. So little information there. Let's talk about the D or the GD tuning. I get them mixed up. Some people call it DG, some people call it GD, DG or GD, reversing that G and D. Either way, it refers to the same thing. All the strings are tuned to either G or D notes, and the keyboard falls naturally in the key of G. Again, you can play other keys, it's just your sharps and flats are kind of rearranged. Let's go back to our violin example and how that relates to a hurdy-gurdy. We spoke a moment ago about the 4 violin strings up on your screen again, E, A, D, G. Let's compare that to a hurdy-gurdy in the DG tuning. So you see we have the E, we drop a note, so it's D, and then we have the other D there. So compared to the CG tuning, it picks up those two violin strings for the basis of the tuning. For the GD tuning, there you go. You see how it kind of relates to a violin, hopefully. Now there's two variants of the GD tuning as well. One is the unison, one is the octave, just like the other one. When they're tuned in unison, you have that two strings tuned to middle D or D4. When you have them tuned in the octave tuning, there's two different variants. One is tuned to D5 and D4, and then there's another variant where they're tuned an octave lower, like D4 and D3. I'll demonstrate both. This is more just about kind of hearing how it sounds to your ear. Let's start with the high octave tuning. Let me rearrange them on Maleficent here. So there's my middle D chanter. Here's my high octave one. That high octave one, if you're thinking about having your gurdy set up like that, it's so high, it's not really useful by itself. In my opinion, it's a little too high. It's a nice shadow effect for the other chanter to play them both together. I'll play the song I played just a moment ago, which is an old French song. And here it is in the GD tuning. If you're wondering, well, why have one of the melody strings so high that you can't play it by itself? I mean, isn't that limiting? I guess technically, yes, in that most of the strings on a hurdy-gurdy can be played by themselves, but personally, I think that high octave tuning is just beautiful, which is why I prefer to have my instrument set up that way. Let's compare and contrast to the unison tuning. You notice I'm really doing a dance with all these hurdy-gurdies here. We strung them up every which way for this demo today. This one is Anwin, my wife's hurdy-gurdy. She calls it Eleanor. Her personal hero is Eleanor of Aquitaine. Anyway, I did a little extra inlay on it. It's based on our Aquitaine body, and I just kind of went a little crazy with the inlay. But otherwise, it's our Aquitaine, little extra melody string thrown in. And I'm going to use it today to demonstrate the unison D tuning. Okay. There's one, and here's the second one tuned exactly the same. Some people really prefer that unison tuning. I think it's quite beautiful myself. In the C-G tuning just a moment ago, I was just marveling, man, I should keep this instrument set up this way. It was in the octave tuning until last night. I threw some strings on it for the unison, and now I'm kind of grooving on it. I guess different flavors, but still kind of the same tuning. I mentioned a moment ago in the DG tuning, there's a couple of variants. There's the unison tuning, which we are working with right now. There's that high octave tuning, which I demonstrated. I'm pointing to my instrument that you can't see. I'll stop that. The high octave tuning, which I demonstrated a moment ago, where the melody strings are D4 and D5, if you're referencing a piano keyboard. There's also a low octave tuning, which I'll demonstrate. And that's D3 and D4. And that one I have a lower octave D. So that's kind of tasty, and then I can couple it back with that middle D, so I have that octave sound. I hope this is coming through okay, and you're getting a sense of the different tunings. What does it matter? Well, it's kind of personal preference. With hurdy-gurdies, just wear one for a while, and if you get in the mood to experiment, you can do that. Again, your hurdy-gurdy maker can make recommendations for you. The next variant I'm going to talk about is when we get into more than 2 melody strings. I mentioned at the intro here, we're going to talk about a soprano gurdy, which is kind of what we've been talking about here. Hurdy-gurdies that are pitched in the violin range. Excuse me a minute. And then an alto gurdy. What is the difference between an alto and a soprano? And I also said we'll compare it to a tenor. We'll circle back around to that in a few minutes. When I say a soprano gurdy, as I mentioned a minute ago, we're comparing it kind of to a violin, which is like a soprano instrument. That refers to the register it plays in, kind of the range of it. When I'm talking about an alto gurdy, I'm talking about more of the viola range. There we go. The 4 strings of a viola, A, D, G, and C. You might not really appreciate the difference between a viola and a violin, so I have another graphic which will illustrate it. On the left side, we see the violin tuning. E, A, D, G. And then the viola tuning, which is A, D, G, and then C. I don't actually have a viola, so I can't play that one for you. If I'm going to compare this to how hurdy-gurdies are tuned, there we go. Now we're talking about, we have, you see the DG tuning on the left, where that E5 is dropped to D. Oops, that should be D5, not D4. Mislabeled. Oh well. The A is dropped to a G for a hurdy-gurdy, and then you have a D and a G. Same with the viola. Usually the A is dropped to a G, so you can get that octave tuning. The A in and of itself tends not to be that useful on a hurdy-gurdy. You can kind of hit it with the range of other strings as far as playing in an A scale. So the octave sound is more useful. Now, if we're looking at a hurdy-gurdy with 3 melody strings, you see there's 3 strings that are the same on between a violin and a viola. Well, if we're on a hurdy-gurdy with 3 melody strings, those melody strings are going to be G, D, and G. So whether it's called a soprano gurdy or an alto gurdy, those are your melody strings. They're kind of the same tuning. Gives you a sense for maybe the differences between them. Not so much in terms of the notes to which they're tuned. There we go. If I compare this to a 3-chanter hurdy-gurdy, again, I mentioned you have the G, D, and G. There it is as denoted on a musical staff. I guess I will give you a demo of a 3-chanter gurdy here. Now I'm using a 4-chanter gurdy. Why not use a 3-chanter gurdy? Well, I don't have one in that tuning, but it's really the same one plus an extra melody string. So again, to demo, we have that high octave G. Let me just pull this graphic back up here. Whoops. There we go. Have my G4, G3, and then right in the middle there is a D4. So you can mix and match your strings to play in different keys, whatever's convenient. I was discussing the differences between an alto and a tenor gurdy and an alto and a soprano. Let's stick with an alto and a soprano right now. Back to, there we go. You see on the right side the 4 string notations, G4, D, G, and C for an alto gurdy tuning. I've got yet another hurdy-gurdy in my hands to demo it. This is a new model I haven't put on our website. It'll hopefully be up in the next week. Got kind of a rounded back. This one has 4 melody strings. It's newly strung up, so I'm noodling with the tuning as we go. There's that high G again. Let's go to our low G. Let's go to our middle D. Okay. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, we have a low C, as you can see there, all the way down to C3, and that sounds like this. I'll turn on the low drone so you can get a sense. It kind of goes down into those lower registers. There we are. All right. I think you have a sense between the tunings and their ranges. What's the difference between an alto and a soprano? Well, we talked about the tuning difference, and I played a little. You can hear the alto tends to dip a little lower on the musical spectrum there. From a builder's point of view, the scale length is going to be a little longer. Just what would be like in the soprano range will be just a little longer. So you need strings to accommodate that scale length. Usually viola strings are used on a hurdy-gurdy for that. Alto versus tenor. Well, I've had people request, can you build me either an alto gurdy, or I think I'd rather have a tenor gurdy. They're tuned the same. Let's pull that up. There we go. There's our 4 chanter-Alto. A tenor clef or an alto clef has kind of the same musical signature, refers to the same notes. On a hurdy-gurdy, it's the exact same tuning. So why are different terms used? Often this is a carryover from people with background in other instruments where there's more of a difference. But when it comes to hurdy-gurdies, you're still looking at pretty much the same notes for your melody strings. The way that plays out on a hurdy-gurdy, I mentioned that the string lengths will be a little longer. Sometimes an alto will be like a shorter length, and a tenor will be like an extra little bit of length on your melody strings. And they'll call that a tenor, even though it's tuned to the same notes. Why go to the trouble? Well, every builder has their own idea of what makes for an ergonomic instrument. The great thing about tenor instruments, they tend to have a longer scale length. I've seen them up to 16.5 inches long for the melody strings, which tends to be pretty long. I've also seen them as short as 14.25 inches. Which is a pretty short scale alto when you're looking at a hurdy-gurdy. Usually that soprano length, you're looking at right around a 13.5 inch scale length. So you're talking a difference of so little. the tone's going to be pretty comparable. So the terms alto versus tenor, it's a bit of a gray area as to which one is which. They're really referring to the same thing. An alto is kind of just a shorter scale. Tenor, still referring to the same tuning and all. Why not go for the full length of the instrument, you might be wondering. Well, the thing about a hurdy-gurdy, the longer you make it, the more the weight starts to distribute towards the head end of the instrument. So when you're playing it, starts to want to cant down. You'll start to feel the weight pull more and more. So if you go with a really super long scale length, your bass will have a little extra resonance as those strings have more room to vibrate and whatnot. You also have a bigger sound box just because it's longer. But the instrument will also be weighted more and more towards the head end. So when you're playing, you might feel it pull on your shoulder a little disproportionately on this side. which way is right and which way is wrong. Every builder kind of balances it out to their tastes. That's part of the art of hurdy-gurdy making, where finding just the right length for that alto where you're still getting some tasty bass tones, but you also have an ergonomically comfortable instrument where it's not going to pitch too much to one side or the other. A lot of us have seen artwork or hurdy-gurdy players where they play like this, with their cranking hand way up here and their hands down here. Yeah, you can set that up with your guitar straps. If it's a balanced instrument, it's not going to weigh too much more down at this head end of the instrument. Even though you're going to cant it that way, you're not going to feel it pulling on you the same way if the weight is balanced properly. Woo! A lot of information. A bit dry. I know we went in the deep end of the pool here. Let's see if we have any questions. Steve Winnert. What is a rule of thumb for extra cost for an alto? And our friend Caradwin from Eureka. Beautiful to see you, Caradwin. Hello. Her husband, Elle. Hope you're doing well, Elle. Say hi to him for us. Had some health problems lately. Steve, what is the rule of thumb for the extra cost of an alto? Great question. The cost is affected by a number of things. The number of strings is the biggest cost. I mentioned a moment ago when we're comparing like a 3-string gurdy, whether an alto or a tenor. I'll pull up my violin viola comparison chart. You see those middle 3 strings are the same, whether it's a violin or a viola. Same with a hurdy-gurdy, whether you're an alto gurdy or more in the soprano range. If you're going with a 3-melody string, the strings are the same tuning either way. So it's just a matter of which strings you put on, whether it's a viola string or a violin string. The difference in cost will be associated with a string set. When you're looking at a 4-chanter-Alto, there we go, with that extra low C there, you have a little extra cost because, again, more strings. When you have more strings on the hurdy-gurdy, you start to get into a more expensive instrument for reasons of, let's look inside the key chest. Here we have 4 melody strings. You see those 4 rows of tangents attaching to each string. On ours, we make our tangents out of metal. So a little extra cost for that. Actually quite a bit. Those are very labor intensive to make. Also balancing out 4 chanters, a lot of extra time involved in the construction of the body. Usually when you're looking in that price range, you're looking more at our full Monty model, which is around that 4,000 to 5,000-ish, depending on the maker. I know some makers get quite a bit above that. There's a lot of extra time involved with all of the aspects when you have an instrument with more strings. I know that might be a vague answer. Contact your maker and they can give you more specifics on pricing if you're interested in that. A lot of it comes down to more materials cost and more time involved for all the little extra parts. I think that covers everything. Thanks for hanging with us, y'all. Sorry we missed the past few weeks. Excuse me. We had some fires here in Southern Oregon. I know those of you who are Facebook friends with me, you've caught some of that. We were evacuated out of the wood shop here for a couple of weeks. We were pretty lucky in that while the fire did get very close to our place, from what I understand, a spot fire broke out on the backside of our fence, but the firefighters actually took care of it. We were very fortunate. However, there are some communities in Southern Oregon, specifically Talent and Phoenix, who got hit quite hard, and I understand somewhere around 2,400 houses were lost. Those communities are about an hour east of us. I'm mentioning it because I have many friends in those communities. And I know people who have personally become homeless because of that. So I'd like to throw up as the last part of our little webcast today, if you have an extra couple of coins to rub together, maybe consider donating to a cause that helps out with the rebuilding of the towns of Phoenix and Talent. They're kind of side-by-side communities. Over half the towns were destroyed. And there we go. There's a local fund, the Phoenix Talent Relief Fund, with a link to a website where you can make donations, or the American Red Cross is always there to help out. I do hope you'll consider that. Thanks for joining in. I'm George Leverett. Feel free to shoot me a message if you have any more questions about this somewhat dense topic. Hopefully it's demystified a bit. Have a beautiful night, and we'll see you next week.